32,000 years ago, a group of human beings was living above the Arctic Circle in northeastern Siberia in temperatures that would kill an unprotected person in under 10 minutes, and somehow they were thriving. Not surviving, thriving. They were hunting large game, making tools of extraordinary precision, raising children, and planning for seasons they had not yet lived through. And they were doing all of this in a place so cold, so hostile, so far beyond the biological limits of the naked human body that modern researchers still debate exactly how it was possible. What if the answer is not what you think? Not fire, not caves, not the size of their brains or the sophistication of their weapons. What if the technology that made human civilization possible, the one invention without which there is no Siberia, no Arctic, no Americas, no northern world at all, was something so ordinary that we pull it on every morning without a second thought? Because when you strip away everything else and follow the evidence to its actual conclusion, one uncomfortable truth keeps rising to the surface. The technology that made us a global species was not built from stone or fire. It was sown, and the story of how it was sown, who made it, what they understood, and why it may have decided the fate of at least one other intelligent species that shared this planet with us, is one of the most important stories in all of human history. A story that has been hiding, this whole time, in plain sight. To understand what clothing meant to Ice Age humans, you first have to understand what the Ice Age actually felt like as a physical environment, not as a concept, but as a daily reality that pressed against the body with lethal intention. The last glacial maximum, which peaked roughly 20,000 years ago, transformed vast portions of the northern hemisphere into something almost incomprehensible to modern experience. The Mammoth Steppe, that enormous corridor of frozen grassland stretching from what is now western France all the way through Siberia and into Alaska, was not simply cold. It was a wind engine. A killing machine driven by the physics of open terrain, where glacial airflows could travel thousands of kilometers without interruption, building velocity across treeless plains until they hit exposed flesh with the force of something designed to destroy it. Winter temperatures across the Siberian interior regularly dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Not -10, not -20. -40, the point where the Fahrenheit and Celsius scales converge, where the distinction between them stops mattering, because at that temperature, the conversation is no longer about comfort. It is about whether you will still be alive in an hour. At -20, exposed human skin begins to suffer frostbite damage in under 30 minutes. At -40, that window collapses to single-digit minutes. In open wind, the effective temperature can be driven even lower by wind chill, compressing that survival window further. And yet, humans were there, not visiting, not passing through, living, hunting, raising children, planning for seasons ahead. The site of Yana, located in northeastern Siberia above the Arctic Circle, contains human artifacts dating back 32,000 years. 32,000 years ago, humans were occupying one of the coldest, most inhospitable environments on the surface of the planet, not because evolution had prepared them for it, but because they had built something that evolution had not. They had built a second skin, and somewhere to the west, in the forests and valleys of Ice Age Europe, another species of human being equally intelligent, equally capable of making fire, equally familiar with cold, was beginning to disappear. Not because of catastrophe, not because of plague, but possibly, in part, because of the precise difference between a garment that was draped and a garment that was sewn. We will come back to that. Here is an uncomfortable biological truth. The human body is extraordinarily bad at surviving cold. Compared to the megafauna that shared the Mammoth Steppe, Homo sapiens is almost comically under-equipped for frigid environments. Woolly mammoths carried layers of dense underfur beneath long outer guard hairs, a system so effective it created a personal thermal environment, even in open blizzards. Cave lions, cave bears, and woolly rhinoceroses had evolved fat reserves and pelage systems over hundreds of thousands of years of cold adaptation. Humans had none of this. Long limbs excellent for heat dissipation in the African savanna, where our deep evolutionary history was written, become a liability in the cold, creating enormous surface area for heat loss relative to body volume. Human skin, essentially hairless by mammalian standards, provides almost no insulation. The sweating system, one of the most sophisticated heat-shedding mechanisms in the animal kingdom, is precisely the wrong tool when the enemy is not overheating but freezing. From a purely biological standpoint, unclothed humans do not belong on the mammoth steppe. They belong closer to the tropics, within a thermal comfort zone that their bare physiology can actually manage. And yet the fossil record shows them not retreating south, but advancing north deeper into cold, higher into altitude, further into environments where biology alone would kill them. Something had to bridge that gap. Something had to compensate for 4 million years of evolution optimized for warmth. That something had to be worn. The oldest preserved garments do not survive. Organic material decays. Animal hides, sinew thread, plant fiber, all of it vanishes over tens of thousands of years, unless preserved in extraordinary conditions like permafrost or extreme aridity. But the tools that made garments do survive, and they are extraordinary. Bone needles slender, often no larger than a modern sewing needle, drilled at one end with a tiny perforation to carry thread, have been found at sites across Siberia and Eurasia, dating back more than 40,000 years. Some specimens recovered from sites in the Altai region of Russia are so refined, so precisely made, that archaeologists initially debated whether they could possibly be that old. They are that old, and their implications are staggering. Because a bone needle is not a crude tool. It is not a pointed stick used to poke holes in hide. A bone needle with an eye is a precision instrument designed for one specific purpose: joining pieces of material with tight, controlled stitching. It implies thread-twisted sinew, or plant fiber, which itself implies the knowledge to create thread, to manage its tension, to work it through material without breaking it. A bone needle implies tailoring, and tailoring is not a small thing. The difference between a draped hide and a tailored garment is not aesthetic, it is survival physics. A loose hide wrapped around the body creates convection channels, pathways where warmed air escapes and cold air infiltrates, wind penetrates. Movement disrupts the thermal layer. In extreme cold, the gap between a loosely draped skin and a fitted sewn garment can represent the difference between maintaining core body temperature and beginning the slow arithmetic of hypothermia. Fitted garments trap air against the body. Trapped air, warmed by body heat, becomes insulation. This is exactly the same principle that drives the design of modern polar expedition gear. Not the thickness of the material itself, but the controlled management of airspace within and around it. Ice Age humans were implementing thermal engineering tens of thousands of years before the physics of heat transfer was formally understood. What Ice Age humans were building was not simply clothing. It was a portable environmental control system. And evidence from later Arctic and subarctic cultures who maintained technological traditions stretching back into deep prehistory suggests that system was layered, deliberate, and remarkably sophisticated. The architecture of extreme cold clothing follows a logic that modern engineers have converged on independently: an inner layer oriented toward the body to trap warm air and wick moisture away from skin, a middle insulation layer to maximize thermal buffering, and an outer shell designed to resist wind penetration and moisture while remaining flexible enough to allow movement. Movement matters enormously. A garment that functions perfectly at rest but stiffens and loses its thermal properties when the wearer bends, walks, or runs is not a survival garment, it is a liability. Ice Age humans, who needed to move constantly to hunt, to relocate camps, to manage the daily labor of survival in frozen environments, needed clothing that worked dynamically. The selection of materials suggests they understood this intuitively. Reindeer fur is composed of hollow hair fibers, a structure that traps air within each individual strand, giving it exceptional insulation per unit of weight and thickness. It was almost certainly the primary material for inner layers and core body coverage. Wolf fur, with its dense, tightly packed guard hairs, resists wind penetration more effectively than most available materials. It appears in later Arctic traditions as hood trim and outer layer material precisely because of this property. Wolverine fur has a unique surface chemistry that resists frost accumulation. Moisture from breath and body heat does not freeze and build up on wolverine fur the way it does on other materials. This is why it appears around face openings in traditional Arctic garments even today, a design solution so effective it persisted for tens of thousands of years. These were not random choices. They were material science, applied without laboratories, derived through observation, failure, injury, and the slow accumulation of generational knowledge about how the physical world behaved. Here is a fact that will change the way you think about the clothes you are wearing right now. You are not the only species that depends on human clothing to survive. There is another organism microscopic, ancient, and completely overlooked, whose entire existence is built around the garments on your body. An organism so intimately bound to human clothing that its very biology serves as a timestamp. A biological clock recording the exact moment in deep history when our ancestors first began wearing clothes regularly enough to change the evolutionary trajectory of a parasite. That organism is the clothing louse. Clothing lice, Pediculus, humanus, are genetically distinct from head lice, their closest relative. Head lice live in scalp hair. Clothing lice live in fabric fibers, in the woven or stitched structures of garments, venturing onto skin only to feed. They cannot survive without clothing. They cannot reproduce without it. Remove the garments from the equation and the clothing, louse as a species, ceases to exist. Which means that the moment clothing lice diverged from head lice is the moment humans began wearing clothes, consistently enough, persistently enough, generation after generation, that an entirely new ecological niche opened up in the fabric of those garments, and a population of lice evolved specifically to fill it. Genetic studies pinpoint that divergence to somewhere between 80,000 and 170,000 years ago. Let that number sit for a moment. 170,000 years ago, modern humans had not yet left Africa. The cave paintings of Europe were more than 100,000 years in the future. Agriculture was so far ahead it was essentially a different universe. And yet, already, human beings were wearing clothes consistently enough that parasites were evolving in response. This pushes the origin of habitual clothing back far beyond what the archaeological record of needles and tools can directly confirm, and it changes the story in a way that almost nothing else does. Because it means humans did not invent clothing because the Ice Age forced them to. They walked into the Ice Age carrying clothing technology they had already refined across tens of thousands of years. They were not reacting to the cold. They had been preparing for it, unknowingly, for longer than recorded history will ever be able to measure. The Ice Age did not create human clothing. Human clothing conquered the Ice Age. For roughly 300,000 years, Neanderthals occupied Europe and Western Asia. They were not primitive creatures. They buried their dead. They made ochre pigments. They used hafted tools. Their brains were, on average, as large as those of modern humans in some specimens, slightly larger. They also survived cold. Earlier glacial periods in Europe had tested Neanderthals repeatedly, and they had endured. But something changed when modern humans expanded out of Africa and into the Neanderthal range roughly 40 to 50,000 years ago. Within 10,000 years, an eye blink in evolutionary time, Neanderthals were gone. The reasons for Neanderthal extinction are genuinely contested among researchers, and no single explanation has achieved consensus. But one thread of evidence keeps surfacing in the debate, and it concerns clothing. Analysis of Neanderthal sites suggests they processed animal hides, but the evidence for fine sewing tools, bone needles with eyes, the instruments of tailoring is sparse or absent in the Neanderthal record. Some researchers have argued that Neanderthal clothing was likely draped or loosely bound, rather than fitted and sewn. If that is true, the thermal difference was measurable and significant. Loose hide coverings in extreme cold lose approximately 30 to 40% more body heat than fitted, tailored garments. In a marginal survival environment where food resources are unpredictable, where energy budgets are tight, where the difference between a successful hunt and a failed one could mean days without calories, that 30 to 40% is not a small variable. It may have been the variable, not intelligence, not language, not social complexity. A needle, an eye drilled through bone, thread passing through that eye and joining two pieces of hide with a seam tight enough to trap air and hold warmth against the body. That may have been the edge. To make survival clothing in an Ice Age environment was not a spontaneous act. It was the output of an enormous, invisible architecture of accumulated knowledge that had to be taught, transmitted, practiced, and preserved across generations. An elder had to teach a child which animals to hunt for which specific thermal properties. A skilled maker had to demonstrate how to clean and prepare hide without destroying its insulating structure. Someone had to know how to twist sinew into thread of consistent tension, how to cut patterns that would fit a moving body rather than a stationary one, how to repair damage quickly enough that a torn seam in midwinter did not become a death sentence. This was not folk knowledge in the casual sense. This was engineering passed down through demonstration, repetition, and the kind of tacit mastery that only comes from years of practice. The bone needles recovered from Ice Age sites are often so small and so refined that their creation alone implies significant manual skill that had to be developed and maintained through sustained effort. Archaeologists have noted that survival clothing cannot be improvised in the cold. You do not begin preparing for winter when winter arrives. You begin months before processing hides during summer hunts, twisting thread over autumn fires, assembling and fitting garments before the temperature makes fine work with cold-numbed fingers impossible. That timeline implies planning across seasons. Planning across seasons implies a conception of future time, of anticipated conditions, of preparation for events not yet arrived. It implies culture in the deepest sense of the word, not just shared behavior, but shared knowledge held across time, transmitted between generations, refined continuously as experience accumulated. The making of Ice Age clothing was, in this sense, one of the earliest expressions of what we now call civilization. Not a city, not a monument, a needle, and the knowledge of how to use it. One element of Ice Age clothing technology deserves particular attention, partly because it is so easily overlooked, and partly because its implications are so significant. Footwear. Heat loss through conduction, the direct transfer of body heat into cold ground, can drain body temperature faster than convective heat loss to cold air. Standing or walking on frozen ground without adequate foot insulation is not merely uncomfortable. In extreme cold, it is acutely dangerous. Direct evidence for Ice Age footwear is rare, but indirect evidence is compelling. The feet of Ice Age humans, examined through skeletal remains, show patterns of wear and development consistent with habitual use of footwear rather than barefoot walking on cold, hard terrain. Analysis of foot bone morphology in Upper Paleolithic populations reflects reduced mechanical stress consistent with shoe use. Later Arctic and subarctic cultures, whose technologies represent living continuations of traditions with roots in the deep past, developed footwear of remarkable sophistication. Layered constructions using grass, moss, and fur created thermal buffers between foot and ground that modern insulated boot technology has refined but not fundamentally surpassed in principle. Grass insulation, in particular, is more effective than it sounds. Dry grass fibers trap air between their structures in a way that provides meaningful thermal resistance, and grass was available across the Mammoth Steppe in quantities that required only the knowledge and labor to harvest and prepare it. The significance of footwear extends beyond warmth alone. Mobility is survival in nomadic hunter-gatherer life. A group immobilized by cold-damaged feet cannot hunt, cannot relocate to better resources, cannot escape danger, cannot maintain the constant movement that Ice Age subsistence required. Footwear was not a comfort item. It was the enabling technology of mobility, and mobility, in the Ice Age economy, was life itself. When we survey the full body of evidence, the bone needles, the lice genetics, the material selection logic, the skeletal data on foot morphology, the thermal physics of fitted versus draped coverings, the parallel traditions preserved in Arctic cultures that maintained Ice Age technologies into the historical record, a coherent picture emerges. Clothing was not a byproduct of human intelligence. It was one of its highest early expressions. The humans who pushed north into Siberia 30,000 years ago, who crossed Beringia into the Americas, who survived the grinding centuries of the last glacial maximum, while woolly mammoths eventually succumbed to the combined pressure of climate shift and human hunting. These were not simply hardy survivors. They were technologists, carrying an invisible infrastructure of knowledge that made their expansion possible. Every fiber of their clothing represented accumulated observation. Every seam represented training and practice. Every material choice represented a theory about the physical world, tested against the unforgiving feedback of actual cold, refined through generations of success and failure. What they built was not just warm, it was a platform that made every subsequent step of human expansion possible, because without it, humans remain tropical. Without it, the Americas are not populated in deep prehistory. Without it, the Arctic is an empty margin at the edge of the world. With it, there is no edge. There is only more world to enter. So the next time you pull on a jacket against the cold, the next time you layer up before stepping out into winter, thinking about nothing more complicated than staying warm for the walk to your car. Consider what that act actually represents. It represents a technology older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than any monument humans have built. It represents knowledge accumulated across tens of thousands of years, passed from person to person through demonstration and practice, refined by generations who paid for their mistakes with frostbite and death. It represents the moment when a species that evolution had optimized for warmth looked at the frozen world expanding before them and decided, with tools small enough to hold between two fingers, that they were going into it anyway. They did not conquer the Ice Age with fire alone. They did not survive it with brute strength or large numbers. They survived it because someone, somewhere, in the long human past, in a camp on a frozen steppe under a sky cold enough to kill, learned to push a thread through a needle and join two pieces of hide together tightly enough to hold warmth against a living body. And then they taught someone else how to do it. That thread, literal and metaphorical, connects them directly to us. Because before cities, before writing, before every structure of civilization we have built on top of civilization, humans first had to solve the cold. And they solved it not with walls. They solved it with knowledge they could carry on their own bodies. If you want to go deeper into the hidden engineering of prehistoric survival, the forgotten technologies, the quiet inventions, the decisions made by people whose names we will never know that shaped the species we became, subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows. Because the technologies that changed history are rarely the largest. They are the ones that allowed us to survive long enough to build history at all.